13 years ago, a 16-month-old boy vanished from a small daycare on a winter afternoon, disappearing without a trace and leaving his family completely devastated. Authorities suspected several staff members as well as individuals who had been seen around the building, but with no body recovered and far too few clues to pursue, the investigation eventually stalled. Yet through all those years, Evan's mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her son was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. Then one day, when an old renovation section was being demolished, workers discovered a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked. A detail that would upend the entire case and shock everyone involved in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. February 2012, Lebanon, a small town in western New Hampshire, was blanketed in the kind of weather typical of the Northeast. Lead gray skies, cold winds sweeping down from the presidential range across the quiet streets, and thick layers of snow piled along curbs, porches, and the parking lots of residential neighborhoods. Rows of black spruce at the forest's edge formed natural folds that enclosed the town, giving it a feeling that was both secluded and cut off from the more populated southern part of the state. The afternoon at Little Fern Daycare, a low wooden building on the edge of the neighborhood, just a few dozen meters from the tree line, unfolded slowly as usual, the squeak of children's rubber shoes on vinyl floors, staff voices echoing through the small rooms, windows rattling faintly with each gust of wind, and the smell of plastic toys mixed with laundry detergent drifting from the washing area at the end of the hall. 16-month-old Evan Porter was in the main playroom, sitting near the low toy shelf, reaching for a colorful wooden block while babbling incoherent baby sounds. He couldn't speak yet, but his curious eyes constantly tracked the movement of staff coming in and out. The caregiver in charge of the toddler group, busy checking diapers, sippy cups, and tidying the space, moved back and forth between the playroom and the snack prep area before stepping out briefly to grab more tissues. When she returned, she immediately noticed something wrong. The spot where Evan had been sitting was empty. He wasn't on the mat, wasn't standing by the toys, and wasn't near the older kids. She quickly checked all four corners of the room, bent down to look under the two small tables, then hurried out into the connecting hallway. The bathroom door was opened, followed by the sound of rushed footsteps up and down the corridor, into the supply room, the staff break room, the kitchenette. Other staff members were called to help. Each searched a different area: cabinets, the nursery corner, the blanket storage, the back door exit, the stroller parking zone. Every door in the building was opened, every hidden corner checked, but no one found Evan. When the boy's parents were called and arrived to search the entire interior alongside staff and still found no sign of him, initial worry turned into palpable panic. Every possible place inside the building had been checked with nothing to show for it, and in the increasingly heavy atmosphere of that winter afternoon, the family decided to call the police. The missing child call from Little Fern Daycare reached the on-duty desk at the Lebanon Police Department on a winter afternoon steeped in New Hampshire's characteristic gray, with the last light of day weakly reflecting off the hardened snow covering the roads. As soon as the report was received, the nearest patrol unit was dispatched to the scene, while command quickly requested additional officers. The first patrol car pulled up to the entrance, and officers entered, while staff were still in a state of distress over being unable to locate Evan. They immediately established an initial lockdown. The main door was secured, entry and exit restricted. All parents still on the premises were asked to remain in designated areas, and an exact list was made of everyone who had been inside the building immediately before and after the moment the caregiver realized Evan was gone. One officer recorded the names of every child present that day, the shift schedule, support staff, and any parents who had arrived but not yet left. The goal was to ensure no one who had been there during the critical window was missed. Meanwhile, two other officers conducted quick initial interviews with each staff member, They asked when the caregiver left the playroom, when she returned, how many people passed through the hallway, and the last moment anyone remembered seeing Evan. Answers focused on routine activities, constant movement between rooms, and monitoring the children, but no staff member could confirm seeing Evan leave the room or hearing any unusual sound. While those preliminary interviews took place, the rest of the responding officers examined the entire layout of the building. They followed the hallway diagram, checking every door: the front door facing the parking lot, the side door near the supply area, and the back door opening onto empty land leading to the forest edge. Each door was inspected for hinge condition, how tightly it closed, ease of opening, and whether it could swing open on its own due to wind or use. The low windows in the playroom and hallway were also checked to determine if they could serve as an exit for a toddler. Once the structural inspection was complete, police marked the areas requiring immediate search in the first phase: the entire playroom, central hallway, kitchenette, staff break room, storage closets, snow-covered backyard, narrow front yard, and the stone walkway leading to the neighborhood. Areas were prioritized based on the likelihood Evan could have wandered into them or been taken there. At that point, however, there was no concrete information, no witnesses, no recorded sounds, no reports of a stranger that could indicate which direction Evan had left the building. For that reason, as soon as the initial scene was secured, police immediately moved to the next urgent task: reconstructing every activity during the 30 minutes before the moment the daycare worker realized Evan was no longer in the room. All staff members on duty that afternoon were asked to gather in a separate area to give detailed statements. One officer recorded everything in strict chronological order, while another focused on cross-checking statements for consistency or discrepancies. The primary caregiver for the playroom stated she had been in the room most of the afternoon, watching the under 2 group, but left briefly to get more tissues from the snack area. She described her absence as just a few dozen seconds, but when pressed for exact times of leaving and returning, her answers shifted slightly between the first and second telling, prompting police to flag that window for further scrutiny. Another staff member who provided building-wide support said she had walked past the hallway leading to the playroom around the same general time Evan disappeared, but couldn't remember exactly whether it was slightly before or after the primary caregiver's stated absence. Her inability to pin it down turned that stretch into a gray area on the timeline. The staff member in charge of preparing snacks for the whole daycare said she had been in the kitchenette for 10 to 20 minutes prior to the discovery and didn't leave until she heard colleagues calling during the search. That statement was solid, but lacked corroboration of when she had last left the kitchenette to return to the common area earlier, since other staff were busy with their own groups. Police also interviewed the cleaning and supply worker, who moved most freely throughout the building. She remembered entering the playroom earlier in the afternoon to collect some items, but wasn't sure if it was before or after Evan went missing, and said the last time she saw Evan was while he was playing near the toy shelf, without being able to place it within the critical 30-minute window. When all statements were cross-referenced, police built a timeline with markers of varying certainty: the moment the primary caregiver left the playroom, moments when at least 2 other staff passed the hallway, the period the kitchenette was continuously occupied, and the stretches when no one could confirm having directly watched Evan. Most of the timeline consisted of gaps, minutes when no one was certain of Evan's location or their own. Notably, there were small inconsistencies between the primary caregiver and the hallway passerby. One said she was gone only briefly, the other thought she passed the hallway close to the critical moment, but wasn't sure if before or after. Another staff member recalled hearing voices from the playroom while organizing supplies, but wasn't sure if they were children's or adults' voices, and certainly not whether Evan was still in the room at that point. These small inconsistencies kept appearing during cross-checking, painting a picture of a timeline that lacked precision and contained multiple critical gaps. The largest gap fell exactly during the short period the primary caregiver left and returned to find Evan gone. Because, during that very window, no other staff statements provided confirmed locations for themselves or verified the state of the playroom. Officers also noted that no one heard unusual noises, no one saw the child leave the room, and no one clearly remembered anyone entering or exiting the playroom in that period. When all raw statement data was compiled, police concluded that the 30-minute timeline leading up to Evan's disappearance was fractured by numerous gray areas, including one brief but decisive interval where no direct witness could account for Evan's actions or the actions of any adult who might have had access to him, making accurate reconstruction of what happened in that window extremely difficult from the very start. After completing the reconstruction of the 30 minutes before Evan vanished, the on-scene officers moved to evaluating the building's structure and every possible exit route to determine whether a 16-month-old child could have left the playroom or the daycare unnoticed. Little Fern Daycare was a single-story wooden building made up of many small rooms connected by narrow hallways. The main playroom sat in the central area, with 2 low windows and 1 door leading to the common hallway. From that hallway, 3 main exits were identified: the front door, the side door near the storage area, and the back door opening toward the unfenced land and forest edge. To assess whether a toddler could open them, police tested each mechanism. The front door had a metal twist knob placed well above Evan's reach and required considerable turning force. The chance a child under 2 could open it unaided was deemed extremely low. It also had an automatic closer that made a noticeable sound when opened, hard to miss if staff were nearby. Next was the side door near storage. It was lighter construction with a push-bar handle, lower than the front, but still above a toddler's reach. The hinges were old, yet it still required a certain amount of push that a 16-month-old would struggle to produce. Additionally, that side area saw occasional staff traffic for supplies, so if Evan approached it, someone would likely have seen him. Finally, the back door, the exit considered most relevant, because it led straight to open land, and the woods had a lever handle lower than the others. And during testing, officers noted the hinges were slightly loose. Though it still required definite pulling force, the door could swing ajar if a strong gust hit it directly, especially in winter's unpredictable winds. Even so, technical evaluation confirmed that even if the door blew slightly open, a child Evan's age would still needed to apply significant additional force to push it wide enough to walk through. Beyond door mechanics, police identified blind spots inside the building. The layout of small connected rooms created several hallway sections not visible from the playroom. In particular, the stretches leading to storage and the kitchenette formed corners where someone passing could go unseen even from the playroom doorway. The area behind the supply counter was another limited visibility spot where a child could slip in briefly without drawing attention amid the general daycare noise. The playroom windows were positioned well for staff to watch the playground, but not for monitoring the hallway or side door. When assessing whether Evan could have left the building on his own, police mapped feasible paths based on the layout. Path 1, from the playroom into the main hallway, then right toward the front door, rated unlikely because that hallway usually had staff traffic. Path 2, out to the hallway then left toward the side door near storage, more plausible because the storage area was quieter in the afternoon, but the door itself was still tall and heavy for a toddler. Path 3, out to the hallway and straight ahead to the back door, considered the most plausible self-exit route because the distance was shortest and that hallway segment had the least constant staff presence. However, exiting via the back door still required force that police could not confirm a child that age could generate. From these assessments, police concluded that all exits remained possible with adult assistance, whereas the chance of a 16-month-old leaving the building undetected on his own existed only under very narrow conditions, such as coinciding exactly with the caregiver's brief absence and a momentarily empty hallway. Identifying possible exits and plausible paths was a crucial step in narrowing the outer search perimeter, while highlighting the need for additional evidence to determine which direction Evan might have gone or been taken in that fleeting window. Immediately after completing the structural assessment of the building and all possible exit routes, the police force moved to the first-round search, focusing on the area near the daycare to determine whether Evan was still inside the building or just outside in the immediate vicinity. The sweep began with the interior space of Little Fern Daycare itself, where every room, hallway, and functional area was systematically rechecked. The team of officers divided the building into smaller zones: the main playroom, children's bathrooms, supply room, auxiliary kitchen, staff break room, storage closet, and central hallway area. In the playroom, officers lifted every floor mat, checked under tables, under toy shelves, behind storage bins, and any spot where a child might accidentally crawl into without staff noticing. They also searched near the low windows and narrow gaps between furniture, but every nook and cranny was empty. In the bathroom and supply areas, officers opened every cabinet, examined each narrow shelf, and carefully looked behind storage containers or under sinks. In the auxiliary kitchen, previously confirmed to have had staff working there for most of the afternoon, police searched every wall corner, every gap beside cabinets, and the spaces beneath counters, but found no relevant signs. The hallway was thoroughly checked by walking its full length, examining previously marked blind spots from the initial assessment and confirming that no child was hiding or trapped in narrow corners. After the entire interior of the daycare was swept one final time with no discoveries, the search team expanded outward to a radius of approximately 200 meters around the building. In front of the daycare was a small parking lot containing a few parent and staff vehicles, along with a stone-paved walkway leading to the nearby residential area. Police examined the entire parking lot, looking under vehicles, between snowbanks, and along the edges for any indication Evan might have passed through. The thick snow cover made finding footprints or slide marks difficult, but they persistently checked every square meter. From the parking lot, the search moved to the backyard, an open area surrounded by low trees and bordering a clearing that led into the woods. The backyard was searched by dividing it into small grids, with each officer responsible for one grid to ensure nothing was missed. They checked low bushes, gaps beside the wooden fence, areas next to two large trash dumpsters, and the old wooden deck once used as an outdoor play corner. In thick snow and cutting cold wind, the search was not easy, but the entire area was thoroughly examined, with no signs of a small child having moved through. After the backyard, police continued expanding southward into the adjacent residential neighborhood of single-story homes connected by stone walkways and narrow yards. Officers knocked on every door to ask if anyone had seen Evan or noticed a child wandering near the daycare around the time of the disappearance. All residents within close proximity to the daycare reported seeing nothing unusual and no lone child in the area. Officers also carefully checked side yards, garage entrances, basement stairwells, or any spot that could create a hidden area a child might enter. Despite the detailed search of each zone, there were no tracks, footprints, or any physical evidence suggesting Evan had ever been there. To the west of the daycare stood a small shed belonging to a nearby resident. The shed was locked, but the owner granted police access. Upon opening it, they searched along shelves, behind paint cans and cardboard boxes, and in the gardening tool section. No signs a child had touched or moved anything. To the east was a gentle slope leading to a little-used side road. Thick snow with no fresh footprints led police to conclude no one had passed that way between Evan's disappearance and the start of the search. To be certain, officers walked the slope, checking bushes along the road and spaces beneath overhanging branches, but the result remained negative. The search team also walked the fence line separating the daycare from the wild land behind it, looking for any disturbance in the snow layer or frozen ground. But nothing unusual was noted. Upon returning to the starting point and rechecking each area once more for confirmation, police concluded that within a 200-meter radius of the building, there was no evidence Evan had moved through or been taken in any direction. The entire first-round search ended with 0 discoveries, causing the immediate daycare vicinity to be marked as yielding no direct clues related to the boy's initial disappearance. With these results, the Lebanon Police Department decided to expand the search to a wider area that included the forest, side roads, and more complex terrain surrounding the building. For effectiveness, they requested assistance from NH Fish and Game, the agency experienced in search and rescue operations in New Hampshire's wooded and mountainous terrain. The combined team established a grid search pattern using diagonal and parallel lines, dividing the surrounding area into multiple sectors to ensure systematic, non-overlapping coverage. The forest behind the daycare extended northward, then widened into low hills before connecting to informal trails. Locals used for hiking in warmer months. However, before the search team began sweeping that area, a daycare maintenance worker informed them he had already checked the northern woods right after hearing Evan was missing and saw no signs, adding that the area was very difficult for a small child to enter alone due to snow and steep terrain. Given time and manpower constraints, this information led the incident commander to temporarily deprioritize intensive searching in that direction and focus instead on areas that appeared more accessible. This was the first mistake in the search process, though at the time the decision was based on the assumption that the maintenance worker had accurately assessed the access and safety of the forest. With the north temporarily ruled out, the teams concentrated on the remaining directions. To the east of the daycare lay a series of narrow trails along the forest edge where snow was deep, but the surface relatively level. Teams advanced in a line abreast formation, maintaining equal spacing to spot tracks or unusual objects. Though snow made footprints nearly impossible to detect, they carefully examined each trail segment, pausing at wider clearings where wind had blown snow aside, but everything only confirmed no small child had entered the area. To the west was a side road leading to a more sparsely populated residential section, lightly traveled and partially screened by low trees. Teams walked the shoulders, checking gaps between bushes, snowbanks that might preserve marks, and depressions beneath young pines. However, the road surface had hardened after days of freezing, and there were no indications a child had been present around the time Evan vanished. The southern direction, adjacent to the neighborhood, was rechecked despite having been covered in the first round. This time, teams extended behind the homes, moving through narrow passages between rows of houses and examining yards obscured by low overhangs, all with no relevant traces. More challenging terrain, such as the gentle slope behind the daycare's trash area and low-lying strips along the side road, was surveyed by Fish and Game in single-file lines, maintaining radio contact to cover areas outside direct sight lines. Spots where a child could become buried or trapped were manually probed with poles to test snow depth, but all results were negative. The search continued southwest to a small trail leading to an open clearing. Teams went to the end and checked low rock hollows in the forest edge, but found nothing. Search lines returned to the start point and switched to horizontal sweeps to ensure both longitudinal and cross coverage of the entire area. Yet despite extending to every place a child might wander into by accident, no tracks, footprints, or physical evidence appeared. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the second-round grid search concluded exactly like the first. Absolutely no clues related to Evan's disappearance. After completing the second-round search without finding any trace of Evan's direction of travel, police shifted to collecting any available video sources that might have captured activity around the daycare at the time the boy vanished, hoping cameras could provide leads that ground searches could not. The first item on the list was Little Fern Daycare's own camera system. According to the manager, the building had one camera at the rear facing the clearing that led to the forest edge, and another in the hallway near the main entrance. However, when police examined the recording equipment, the system produced no data. The monitor displayed an error message, and the storage drive contained no video files from the incident time. Daycare staff explained that the camera system frequently malfunctioned and had been unreliable for weeks. But since it was a small facility, with no mandatory surveillance requirement, the issue had never been repaired. Police removed the recorder casing for a quick inspection, but found no recoverable stored data. Hoping neighboring cameras could fill the gap, officers went door to door and to nearby businesses, collecting footage from private outdoor or storefront security cameras. However, the 2012 setting made this approach difficult. Many homes in the area still had no outdoor cameras, and those that did mostly used older equipment that performed poorly in cold weather. Some residents said their cameras recorded only on motion detection, and heavy snow plus strong wind often triggered false recordings or caused complete failure. At a small store a few hundred meters from the daycare, police obtained the hard drive from the front door camera system, but on-site review showed the device retained footage for only a very short period and had already overwritten the relevant time frame due to limited storage capacity. One home with a porch camera facing the daycare agreed to provide data, but police discovered the camera was timer set to record only morning and early afternoon to save power. Evan's disappearance occurred precisely during the off period. At an auto repair shop on the Western Side Road, police hoped a street-facing camera might have captured unusual people or vehicles, but that device also yielded nothing usable. The lens had been completely obscured by ice buildup for days. A gas station about half a mile away had cameras, but their placement only covered the payment area and did not include the small road leading to the daycare. Even reviewing all archived footage from the day Evan went missing revealed no images of a small child or any suspicious strangers. After collecting more than 10 camera sources within a several hundred-meter radius, police concluded that virtually none were operating reliably at the critical time. Those that had data had either overwritten it, recorded incorrect times, or were pointed away from the relevant area. Combined with the daycare's own non-functional system, the result was that no usable video existed to help verify Evan's direction of movement or show anyone else approaching the building during the key window. Ultimately, the review of all nearby camera systems ended without producing any useful information, forcing authorities to continue seeking other non-video data sources to determine what happened in the minutes Evan vanished from the playroom. After the entire camera system around the daycare was checked, but yielded no footage that could help determine Evan's direction of movement, the police shifted their focus to gathering statements from people who lived in or passed through the area around the time of the boy's disappearance, hoping that civilian observations might provide clues that technology or equipment had failed to capture. The police started with the closest houses, going door to door to ask if anyone had seen unusual activity, strangers, unfamiliar vehicles, or anything else out of the ordinary on the afternoon Evan was reported missing. Some neighbors said they had stayed indoors to avoid the cold and hadn't noticed anything outside due to the low temperatures, but one woman who lived directly across from the daycare said she heard a child crying that afternoon, though she couldn't pinpoint the exact time and wasn't sure whether it was Evan or just the usual sounds coming from the daycare. A man who lived near the eastern walkway said he hadn't seen any small children on the street while he was shoveling snow in his front yard, but the time he was shoveling didn't perfectly match the time frame the police were analyzing, so his statement was recorded only as supplementary information. A parent who had come to pick up her child that afternoon was also interviewed. She said that when she left the daycare, she didn't see any children wandering alone in the area, and a staff member had been standing near the main front door at the time, making it highly unlikely that a child could have slipped out that way unnoticed. However, she didn't clearly remember whether anyone had been near the side door or the back door when she left, so the police noted her statement but couldn't draw any firm conclusions from it. A young man who had walked past the daycare area that afternoon reported seeing a silver pickup truck parked near the line of trees on the west side, a spot that wasn't a normal place for parents to park. He didn't see anyone get in or out of the truck and wasn't sure whether it belonged to someone in the neighborhood, since the winter afternoon light was fading and he was fairly far away. When asked for more details, he could only recall that the truck bed looked pretty old and had no company logos on it. The police considered this statement noteworthy and flagged the silver pickup as something to cross-reference with other witness accounts. One of the most significant statements came from Brenda Lowell, a former daycare employee. When police contacted her to ask whether she knew anything relevant, Brenda said she had happened to pass by the area on the day Evan disappeared to pick up some personal belongings she had left behind from when she previously worked there. Brenda stated that she had been near the daycare that afternoon, but hadn't gone inside and hadn't noticed anything unusual. However, the time she said she was there didn't perfectly line up with what another daycare employee remembered, creating a small inconsistency in the timeline the police were trying to reconstruct. When pressed for more details, Brenda couldn't recall which direction she had left in, or whether she had noticed any cars parked nearby, making her statement both important and imprecise, and the police marked it for further follow-up. Besides Brenda and the man who saw the silver pickup, the police continued interviewing other parents who had picked up children during the relevant time frame. Some parents had no clear memory of anything outside because they were focused on getting their kids into the car and leaving quickly in the extreme cold, while others only recalled normal activity, staff locking doors, children putting on coats, or familiar parent vehicles. No one definitively saw a child walking alone, no one remembered seeing a stranger lingering near any of the entrances, and no one reported being drawn to any unusual sounds or movements. The few other passers-by in the area at that time also provided no clear leads. One man out walking for exercise said he had only walked along the main road and never went near the daycare side of the street, while a cyclist said he had been moving too fast to notice anything specific about the area. When all the statements were compiled, the police filtered out the details that had the potential to connect to Evan's disappearance. Brenda Lowell's presence in the area that afternoon, the sighting of the silver pickup parked near the trees, the minor discrepancy in Brenda's timing, and several gaps in staff and parent recollections about who had walked past the side and back entrances during the critical window. Based on these elements, the police established a list of 5 potential persons of interest for deeper scrutiny. The man who saw the silver pickup but couldn't remember the license plate. Brenda Lowell, because she was near the daycare at a key moment. A parent who left during a hard-to-pinpoint time frame. An assistant staff member at the daycare who was unclear about when they moved between rooms. And a local resident who was known to frequently hang around the area behind the daycare, but whose presence that afternoon had not yet been confirmed. Although there was still no concrete evidence directly linking any of these 5 people to Evan's disappearance, they were placed under review as the only individuals who could be connected based on the initial statements. The only puzzle pieces the authorities had at a stage where there was no video, no traces, and no physical evidence. When gathering statements from neighbors, passers-by, and daycare staff produced only an initial suspect list but no confirmatory data, the police shifted to collecting electronic data to identify which devices had been present around Little Fern Daycare during the window when Evan vanished. A cell tower dump, the complete list of every mobile device that connected or pinged the nearest tower, was one of the key tools that could reveal who was in the area during a narrow time frame that human eyes and cameras had missed. However, in 2012, obtaining data from carriers still depended heavily on paperwork, processing delays, and the priority level of each request, so the decision to pursue this data wasn't made immediately in the first hours after Evan went missing. By the time a lead investigator formally prepared and submitted the request to the carrier serving the Lebanon area, enough time had passed to seriously compromise the data's availability. In 2012, carriers typically retained cell tower records for very short periods, some only 24, 72 hours, others longer but rarely more than a week, unless the data was tied to a system outage or an emergency legal hold. When the Lebanon police request finally arrived, the carrier responded that the records from the relevant time frame had already been automatically purged and no backup copies existed, eliminating any chance of identifying which devices had been near the daycare when Evan disappeared. This meant the police could not determine whether any unknown devices, such as someone who didn't live in the neighborhood or hadn't already been mentioned in statements, had appeared near the daycare at the critical moment. Without the tower dump list, they had no way of knowing how many phones were in the vicinity, which of them belonged to staff, parents, or local residents, and most importantly, which ones, if any, belonged to people who had never been interviewed. The absence of a tower dump made every theory involving a stranger approaching the daycare impossible to either prove or disprove. Even the silver pickup sighting couldn't be cross-checked against cell data to see whether a device associated with its driver had been in the area at the right time. Instead of quickly ruling out devices belonging to residents, staff, and parents, the police were forced to keep relying on incomplete and inconsistent witness statements, while the one electronic tool capable of independently confirming the presence of a stranger was no longer available. Additionally, the lack of a tower dump prevented investigators from checking whether any devices belonging to staff or others known to be inside the daycare that afternoon had made unusual movements during the disappearance window. If the data had existed, police could have cross-referenced who left the area at the critical time, or whether any specific device traveled from the daycare to another location immediately after Evan was reported missing. Because the data was gone, none of that analysis could be performed. As a result, phone tracking, a routine investigative method in later cases, was essentially off the table here. The absence of electronic data significantly weakened the police's ability to identify suspects, since they couldn't filter people based on movement patterns or the random appearance of unknown devices in the area. In a case with no footprints, no security footage, and no direct physical evidence, the cell tower dump could have been the crucial link to narrow the suspect pool. But because the request was sent too late, the only information capable of providing an objective, independent snapshot of human presence around the daycare no longer existed. This left the list of 5 persons of interest, compiled from witness statements, as the sole basis for continuing the investigation. Even though that list relied largely on subjective impressions, imperfect memories, and a few minor inconsistencies that had no supporting evidence. In many child disappearance cases, cell tower data has served as a turning point in identifying unusual individuals, but here, losing that opportunity from the very beginning pushed the investigation onto a much more difficult path, forcing authorities to keep working with fragmented information unsupported by any electronic evidence to figure out who might have been involved in Evan's disappearance. After the failure to obtain electronic data and its inability to help narrow the suspect pool, investigators returned to the most basic hypotheses, among which the possibility that Evan left the building on his own was re-examined systematically to determine whether this was a realistic scenario or merely a theoretical one. To evaluate this hypothesis, police first relied on the physical capabilities of a 16-month-old child at that time. Since this was the core factor determining whether Evan could have left the playroom, walked down the hallway, and reached any of the exterior doors on his own. According to daycare staff and the parents' information, Evan could walk but was still slow and unsteady on slick or uneven surfaces. He could take several steps in a row, but still needed to steady himself by holding onto furniture or walls. Moving around the familiar playroom environment was something he could do, but navigating a long hallway with multiple turns and open spaces could easily cause him to lose direction. Investigators also noted that children this age tend to move toward light or familiar sounds, but the playroom was centrally located, with no direct exit to the outside that didn't require passing through the hallway. Therefore, for Evan to leave the building by himself, he would have had to leave the playroom, enter the hallway, and reach one of the 3 exterior doors: the main front door, the side door near the storage area, or the back door that faced the tree line. After assessing mobility, the police analyzed whether Evan could have opened a door by himself. The main front door had a round metal knob placed well above Evan's head height and required a relatively strong twist. A 16-month-old would have virtually no chance of reaching it and almost no ability to turn it with enough force to open the door. The side storage area door had a push-bar handle that was still far out of Evan's reach, and the door itself was heavier than the playroom doors, requiring a push that the child likely couldn't generate. The only door with slightly higher physical feasibility was the back door, whose lever handle was lower, though still higher than Evan could easily reach. Even so, the force needed to depress the lever and pull the door open was considerable, because the back door was designed to withstand winter winds, and although the hinges were a bit loose, the door would not swing fully open without deliberate force. When investigators conducted simulations, they determined that even if Evan stood right next to the door and stretched, the odds of him touching the handle were practically zero. This made the likelihood of Evan opening any door by himself extremely low. After evaluating mobility and door operation capability, investigators moved on to the time factor. Based on statements, the staff member in charge had left the playroom for a short period and returned shortly afterward to discover Evan was gone. Although the exact duration hadn't been pinned down with absolute certainty, all accounts agreed it was a very brief window, short enough that police concluded if Evan had left the playroom and headed to the back door on his own, he would have had to move continuously in a single direction without pausing or becoming distracted in the hallway. Yet every daycare employee described Evan as easily distracted, often stopping for toys or sounds. Thus, the distance he would have needed to cover, from his spot in the playroom, down the hallway, to the back door, would have required a sustained sequence of movements while no adult noticed, which was highly improbable in the narrow, busy space of the daycare. Furthermore, police calculated that if Evan had made it outside, he would have left some trace within a 200-meter radius of the daycare. Whether footprints, slide marks in the snow, or someone in the neighborhood noticing him. Yet both the first and second search sweeps found no physical signs or witness accounts indicating Evan had ever exited a door or moved around outdoors. If he had gone out the back door, he would have faced deep, cold snow that would slow him down, cause him to fall, or leave clear tracks. No such tracks were found. All of these factors, limited mobility of a 16-month-old door handles placed well out of reach, the force required to operate the doors, the extremely short time window, and the complete absence of any physical signs within the search radius, collectively showed that the hypothesis of Evan leaving the building on his own lacked clear supporting evidence. Although investigators did not entirely rule it out, they found no direct or indirect evidence to support the idea that Evan could have opened a door and walked out of the daycare without anyone seeing him. After evaluating the hypothesis that Evan left the building on his own and finding it lacked solid grounding, the investigation shifted to analyzing the remaining hypothesis: Evan was carried out of the daycare during the period when staff had left the playroom. This approach required simultaneously examining witness statements, the building's layout, and the gaps in the timeline to determine whether an adult could have taken Evan outside without being detected. Four main hypothetical scenarios were considered: carrying Evan out through the back door, through the side door, through the front door, or being carried by someone familiar to the daycare staff who would not draw attention. Regarding the back door, it led to the edge of the woods, was the least trafficked of the three exits, and was the most concealed. Structurally, this door was located in a hallway where, at the time Evan disappeared, no staff member confirmed standing nearby. However, the back door was heavy and required force to pull open, so if someone carried Evan through it, opening the door could have made some noise, even if minor. No one reported hearing the door slam or creak, but given the noisy environment of a daycare full of small children, the possibility that such a sound was overlooked still existed. Nevertheless, the statements from the playroom staff and the two employees who moved through the hallway did not align clearly enough to determine whether anyone approached the back door during that window. Thus, the back door was deemed feasible, but no specific evidence supported it. As for the side door, it was located near the storage area, rarely used during peak hours, and had limited visibility from the playroom. Anyone wanting to carry Evan out this way would have to walk down a narrow hallway and turn left before reaching the door. One support staff member stated she had passed through that area but could not recall the exact timing relative to Evan's disappearance. This created a blank period during which a child could potentially have been carried down the hallway undetected. However, the side door had a handle higher than a small child's reach, though not an issue for an adult, and there was still no statement confirming anyone stood near or opened that door during the critical time frame. Therefore, this door was also judged feasible, but lacking corroborating evidence. Regarding the front door, it was the most visible entrance/exit, and typically had parents or staff passing by during pickup hours. To carry Evan out the front without anyone noticing, the person would have had to act extremely quickly or time it with someone else entering or leaving, so their presence appeared normal. One parent stated that when she left the daycare during the possibly relevant period, a staff member was standing near the front door, making the likelihood of removing Evan through the front undetected lower. However, this statement was never cross-referenced with any camera footage or other data source, so it could not be confirmed absolutely. Thus, the front door was not completely ruled out, but its feasibility was rated lower than the other two. The final hypothetical scenario involved Evan possibly being carried by someone familiar to the daycare staff or local residents, meaning their presence in the hallway or near the building would not raise suspicion. A few staff statements noted that certain acquaintances occasionally appeared at the daycare to help with tasks or pick up their own children, but no one could recall who exactly was present the afternoon Evan disappeared. One support staff member said she might have seen someone pass by the playroom door, but was unsure whether it was a daycare employee or a parent. That statement was too vague to hold value but forced police to include the familiar person possibility in their list of hypotheses. Beyond this vague statement, however, there was no evidence that anyone other than staff and parents was present at the daycare during the critical moments. When analyzing all four scenarios, investigators concluded that each had a certain degree of plausibility based on the gaps in the timeline and the building's layout, yet none was supported by concrete evidence. No one saw Evan being carried out. No one heard a door open. No one remembered a stranger walking through the hallways, and there were no physical signs indicating the direction of movement. While these hypotheses were logically possible, the complete absence of evidence left them at the level of speculation. Ultimately, investigators had to note that although the hypothesis of Evan being carried out appeared more reasonable than him leaving on his own, all four exit routes lacked clear evidence to confirm that any had actually occurred. By the end of 2012, after weeks of crime scene processing, collecting statements, expanding search areas, and analyzing every accessible piece of data, investigators had uncovered no new leads that could explain what happened during the period Evan vanished from the playroom. A comprehensive review of the case file revealed a stark reality. No direct physical evidence was found inside or around the daycare. Every searched area yielded no trace, not even a single footprint or dropped item. The daycare's camera system was inoperable, and neighboring cameras provided no footage from the relevant time. Cell tower dump data had been deleted before police could obtain it, preventing identification of any devices near the daycare when Evan disappeared. Statements from staff, parents, and neighbors failed to form a coherent sequence of events. They contained numerous gaps and inconsistencies, but none were significant enough to justify deeper investigation of any specific individual. The initial 5 persons of interest were identified mainly from indirect statements and unclear movement patterns, yet none exhibited clear evidence or suspicious behavior sufficient to classify them as criminal suspects. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no direct witnesses. Every line of inquiry circled back to the starting point, as if Evan had vanished without leaving any physical consequence. When assessing the case file in terms of investigative progress, the team realized that every viable data source had been exhausted without producing a breakthrough. Analytical tools from statements and building layout to movement paths and electronic data offered no clear next step. Investigative efforts had reached the limit of what was possible at that time without new evidence. Consequently, the Lebanon Police Department was forced to make the procedural, yet heavy decision to reclassify Evan Porter's missing person case as pending review, meaning active investigation was suspended and would resume only upon new information, new physical evidence, or a valuable new statement. The file was archived as an unsolved case with no clear direction, with the interim conclusion that existing data was insufficient to identify a suspect, reconstruct events, or pursue further in-depth investigative steps. Though still on the watch list, by the end of 2012, the case had officially entered a state of deadlock. From 2013 to 2017, Evan Porter's disappearance remained on the periodic review list, and whenever a new detective was assigned to the cold case unit, the file was pulled and re-examined per protocol. The first detective in this period reviewed all documentation: crime scene reports, daycare staff statements, neighbor and passerby accounts, search operation notes, and building layout analyses. He also re-examined summaries of when each staff member left the playroom, when parents moved through the area, and the documented gaps in the timeline, but every detail aligned with prior assessments. Nothing indicated a breakthrough or an overlooked angle. Later, another detective conducting routine reviews started over from the beginning, focusing especially on inconsistent statements, but those minor discrepancies were attributed to faulty memory or delayed reporting rather than grounds for suspicion. The 30-minute timeline before Evan vanished remained full of gaps and gray areas, with no new data to fill them. The original list of 5 persons of interest, compiled from statements and proximity to the daycare, was rechecked. The detective attempted to verify their most recent whereabouts and cross-reference with old records, but nothing emerged that constituted a breakthrough. None displayed unusual behavior during the relevant period, none were arrested or linked to similar cases afterward, and no new resident statements added anyone else to the list. When locals were re-interviewed in subsequent years, they only confirmed they remembered nothing beyond what they had initially reported. Re-examination efforts also included reviewing search reports, but because weather and time had altered the original scenes, re-verifying previously searched areas no longer held practical value. The possibility that Evan left the building on his own remained unchanged, as no additional documentation either supported or refuted it. In the end, all related information remained stagnant: no physical evidence, no camera footage, no electronic tracking data, and no new witness statements. This left the 2013-2017 review period concluding, as usual, that no valuable new information had surfaced, and the original suspect list remained unchanged from when the case was placed in pending review status at the end of 2012. During the 2017-2022 period, Evan Porter's file continued to appear on the cold case unit's periodic review roster. When a new team of detectives accessed the file, they re-examined all materials once more, focusing on details previously noted but not fully pursued. Among these were a series of ancillary reports about local residents seeing a silver pickup truck in the area around the time Evan disappeared. These were not new statements, but scattered notes from earlier interviews, recording that a few residents had reported seeing an unfamiliar silver truck parked near the western tree line or moving slowly through the neighborhood. Upon deeper review, however, the detectives realized these reports had never been cross-checked against local vehicle registrations or residents' car lists, primarily because at the time there was no camera footage, no license plate, and the statements lacked precise timing, so they were treated as supplementary rather than investigative leads. Failing to follow up on them initially may have been an oversight, but by 2017-2022, when detectives tried to verify further, most residents had moved away or no longer recalled details, rendering additional confirmation impossible. Besides the silver truck reports, another internal note caught the team's attention. 2012 documentation stated the backdoor camera was not recording the day Evan disappeared, yet there was no evidence the system had ever been technically examined beyond the on-screen error message. Detectives reviewed the technical logs and discovered that because the daycare was a small facility, the original team had not prioritized dismantling the unit or checking the storage chip, relying mainly on on-site assessment. By 2017-2022, however, returning to inspect the system was impossible. The equipment had been replaced, and the building had undergone multiple renovations that significantly altered its original structure, meaning even the camera note could no longer be pursued. Apart from these 2 points of interest, the rest of the file was reviewed, using the same process as previous years, and the conclusion remained unchanged. No new progress. No new witnesses emerged. No residents provided additional details. No information came from other agencies regarding Evan's disappearance, and no new factors surfaced from former daycare staff. All data remained the same old disjointed records, partially mismatched statements, and hypotheses never backed by evidence. Despite the team's efforts to cross-reference records and re-examine every detail from the day of the incident, they reached the same conclusion as prior reviews. The file lacked sufficient information to expand investigation in any direction, and all potential leads were either unverifiable or no longer practically valuable. Thus, the 2017-2022 review period closed without altering the case structure or suspect list in any way. In early 2023, when the old Little Fern daycare building was sold to a local real estate company and slated for demolition to make way for new construction, an unexpected development occurred, the most significant breakthrough since Evan vanished in 2012. While removing a wall-mounted heating unit in what had been the daycare's secondary kitchen area, workers noticed a small object fall from a gap behind the heater's frame as they pulled the unit from the wall. At first, they thought it was just debris or a part that had fallen into the wall cavity over years of operation, but upon picking it up, they discovered it was an old micro SD card, its plastic casing scratched and coated in soot-like dust from being trapped in the enclosed space behind the appliance. The appearance of a memory card in such an inaccessible location struck the site supervisor as unusual, because the secondary kitchen was not a place where electronic storage devices were typically kept, and a micro SD card would not easily fall into that crevice unless it had belonged to equipment once installed in the area. Suspecting it might be related to the building's time as a daycare before closure, the supervisor reported the find to the Lebanon Police Department, which still maintained the active file on Evan Porter's unsolved disappearance. When officers arrived, they quickly examined the card and noted that its size and type matched those commonly used in older surveillance cameras, especially in small facilities like a daycare. This raised the possibility that the micro SD card belonged to the Little Fern daycare's camera system, which had been reported as non-functional at the time of Evan's disappearance. With the daycare long closed and the building about to be demolished, police immediately seized the card as potential evidence related to the case, even though the condition of any remaining data after more than a decade in the wall was unknown. After documenting the seizure, the card was transferred directly to the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit, which specializes in handling cold cases statewide and possesses the capability to extract, recover, or analyze data from old storage devices. Upon receipt, the Cold Case Unit documented the card's physical condition. One edge was worn thin, the surface had small cracks, the contact pins showed light oxidation, and the entire card was covered in fine dust. Although nothing guaranteed that data still existed, the digital forensics team assessed recovery as not ruled out, especially since the card had been in a location shielded from direct weather and only exposed to heater temperature fluctuations. The next step was to place the card in temporary protective storage by carefully cleaning the dust and drying the surface to avoid damaging the microchip when inserted into a reader. They then prepared a specialized reader designed for damaged cards, equipped with short-circuit protection, surge prevention, and the ability to isolate individual data layers if the controller was faulty. Before attempting to read data, the team ensured the card would not damage the reader, and vice versa. They photographed every surface, documenting the size of each crack and wear point for later analysis in case full recovery failed and chip-level deconstruction became necessary. Once deemed safe, the card was inserted into the test reader in input check mode, which only determines whether the card responds without accessing data directly. Results showed a very weak signal response, meaning the card was not completely dead and still had a chance of containing unerased data. Recognizing this could be the most important piece of evidence to surface in over a decade of a stalled case, the Cold Case Unit began preparing the next steps for video data recovery. They planned a three-phase process. Phase 1 would extract raw data at the most basic level to determine how many files once existed. Phase 2 would recover corrupted or overwritten files using data carving software. Phase 3 would enhance footage through brightening, noise reduction, and frame reconstruction if the card indeed contained daycare camera video. While the initial reader scan ran, detectives updated the case file with the discovery details, including exact location, physical condition, and the timeline of the building's demolition. They also revisited prior notes on the building's camera system, discovering that the rear camera had been reported as not recording, but there was no record of the memory card ever being checked or seized in 2012. This made the possibility that the micro SD card was a long-lost piece of the surveillance system more plausible than ever. And although no conclusions were reached at that point, the discovery of the memory card inside the soon-to-be demolished building marked the first physical evidence to emerge, after more than a decade, opening a new opportunity to re-examine what actually happened that afternoon. Evan vanished, and for the first time since 2012, the case file recorded evidence with the potential to completely shift the direction of analysis. The data recovery process from the micro SD card began immediately after the specialized reader confirmed that the card was still responding to signals. The digital forensics team of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit performed the first step in forensic video recovery, extracting raw data from every partition on the card, including those that were corrupted or unreadable by conventional methods. The specialized software they used was capable of copying each data cell into a separate disk image to avoid damaging the remaining structure of the card. After many hours of continuous operation, the system extracted a list of fragmented files, mostly damaged videos with small sizes and many segments containing incomplete identifiers. Some files were heavily fragmented and scattered among empty data sectors, suggesting the card had likely been overwritten or affected by temperature conditions while trapped behind the heater for years. However, the team still located a larger-than-normal data cluster whose structure matched the video file format, matched the old camera system previously used at the daycare. They isolated this cluster and initiated the frame reconstruction process. The software stitched together adjacent data segments while identifying missing fragments and attempting recovery using predictive image algorithms. Once the file reassembly was complete, the team obtained a video clip less than 1 minute long, with extremely dark imagery, heavy noise, and almost impossible to identify with the naked eye. This was believed to be footage from the daycare's rear door camera on the day Evan disappeared, but the data condition made initial analysis nearly impossible. The next step was to apply brightening and noise reduction techniques. The team created multiple copies of the video to test different methods without affecting the original file. The processing algorithms included gamma enhancement, histogram equalization, grain noise removal, contrast boosting, and edge restoration to detect object outlines in the darkness. When run through the brightening filters, brighter patches began to appear, allowing distinction between the static background and movement. At first, there were only vague black blocks and faint white streaks flashing across frames, but as contrast was increased and noise reduced, the image gradually became clearer. Part of the rear door frame emerged, with a continuously moving dark area in front of it. When the team further sharpened the image and refined the edges, a human silhouette began to appear. The figure had no discernible face, just a black silhouette against the faint backlight, but it was visible that the person was slightly bent forward, both arms cradling a small object close to the chest. Most striking was that the object's size corresponded to that of a child, approximately Evan's age. At the 13th second of the clip, the silhouette crossed the center of the frame, and for a brief moment, thanks to the brightening, a slight movement of the carried object could be seen, similar to the way a small child's body shifts when held. The team paused on individual frames and magnified them multiple times to check whether the object could be something else, but the shoulder curve, head outline, and overall length all matched simulations of a 16-month-old child's silhouette. When analyzing the silhouette's movement, the team noted the person walked with a slight lean to the left, longer than average strides, and a slow but deliberate pace, typical of someone carrying a heavy load or holding a small child. The person's relative height was estimated by comparing it to the known dimensions of the doorframe and back wall. The silhouette was taller than 5'11" inches, 1m80, or at least in the 5'10", 6'2" inches, 1m78, 1m88 range, depending on the degree of forward lean while walking. After identifying the silhouette, the team shifted focus to the left corner of the screen, where an unusual light reflection appeared. When brightness was increased and grain noise reduced, the reflection gradually resolved into the outline of a vehicle. Since the video only captured the rear portion of the vehicle and part of the left side, they applied profile reconstruction techniques to determine the make and model. Based on the bed shape, body line curvature, light reflection on the paint, and tailgate height relative to the ground, the team concluded it was a mid-size pickup truck, most likely a mid-2000s Ford F-150. The color reflected through the noise and low light appeared silver or light gray. More importantly, the video showed the truck parked right against the west fence of the daycare, the exact spot where a witness had previously reported seeing a silver pickup in the area on the afternoon Evan vanished. As the team continued analyzing movement in the video, they observed the silhouette entering from the right side, carrying the small object, walking toward the truck, then disappearing from frame without revealing further details of the vehicle or subsequent actions. Despite the severe quality limitations, key characteristics were extracted: a tall, large-built person, off-center gait, while carrying a small object, continuous movement toward the parking location, and the presence of a silver pickup, not in the daycare's main parking area. The team documented every observable feature: estimated height of the unknown subject, direction of travel, likelihood of carrying a small child, truck bed shape, vehicle color, parking angle, and relative timestamp within the clip. When all data was compiled, they concluded that although the clip was short and of poor quality, it was the only known recording directly related to the daycare's rear door on the day Evan disappeared. The appearance of an adult carrying a small object and walking toward a silver pickup constituted the first visual evidence in over 10 years, suggesting an adult left the daycare premises with an object the size of Evan's body, and with an unidentified vehicle present. The video became the most important piece of evidence ever recovered in the case. Once the recovered video revealed a silver pickup parked against the west fence of the daycare, investigators immediately moved to the next task, compiling a list of silver Ford F-150 SAs registered in the area in 2012, the year Evan disappeared. This step was deemed essential because the bed shape, body lines, and paint color in the video matched this highly popular model widely used by New Hampshire residents. The team contacted the New Hampshire Department of Motor Vehicles to pull records of all silver or light gray F-150 SAs registered in 2012 in Lebanon and surrounding towns. However, due to the large number of such vehicles spread across multiple communities, they narrowed the scope using specific filters: reasonable travel radius from the daycare, average distance a vehicle could cover before and after the time of disappearance, and likelihood the owner had reason to be in the area that day. After analyzing residential maps and local road networks around the daycare, investigators limited the search to an approximately 10-mile radius from Little Fern Daycare, the feasible residential range for someone with work or daily activities nearby. From the statewide database containing hundreds of matching F-150s, filtering by color, registration year, and geography quickly reduced the list to 17 vehicles within the defined radius. The list included vehicles owned by individuals, several small businesses, a few households with multiple identical trucks, and some registered to construction or service companies. Investigators began vetting each owner, checking 2012 residence addresses, registration status, employment records, and possibility of being near the daycare at the critical time. Several owners were immediately ruled out because they were verifiably working out of state or traveling, supported by work schedules or receipts from distant locations. Others lived in nearby neighborhoods but had no plausible reason to pass the daycare that afternoon. They stated they were home or transporting children to schools many miles away, and cross-checks with old statements, neighbor accounts, and provided travel data showed no inconsistencies. A few commercial F-150s were excluded based on detailed service invoices or delivery logs that accounted for their exact locations. Through successive eliminations, the original list of 17 was whittled down to just a handful of owners who lacked clear verification, either because 2012 records were incomplete or because they could not provide reliable timeline evidence. Within this small group, one name stood out: Mark Ellery, a Lebanon resident who owned a 2006 silver Ford F-150 registered at the time of the disappearance. Mark worked freelance maintenance for numerous local families and small businesses, and a 2012 daycare record noted he had previously been hired to repair the rear drainage system sometime before the incident. What drew investigators' attention was not only that he owned the exact make and color seen in the video, but also that his home was within a 3-mile radius of the daycare, a distance any local could cover in minutes without attracting notice. When reviewing Mark's 2012 timeline, investigators noted a suspicious detail. Mark claimed that on the afternoon Evan disappeared, he was home in his garage, replacing parts, and did not leave until after dark. However, no evidence supported this claim. No one saw him in the garage, there were no same-day parts receipts, and neighbors simply didn't recall whether he was home. Another point of interest was that, in the month of the incident, Mark had performed minor repairs near the daycare twice, replacing drain pipes and checking sewers. Although invoices confirmed those jobs were legitimate, the fact that his presence near the daycare was not tied to irregular freelance work rather than a fixed schedule made his record less solid. When Mark's timeline was compared to the recovered video, investigators noted a noteworthy coincidence. Mark was approximately 6'0" inches, 1 m83, within the estimated height range of the silhouette, and his general build matched the abstract shape extracted by the restoration software. Additionally, Mark was one of the few remaining silver F-150 owners who could not account for his whereabouts during the critical window when Evan was discovered missing, creating the largest alibi gap among the remaining candidates. Further review of Mark's 2012 records revealed he had a highly flexible freelance schedule with no fixed hours, meaning he could come and go unnoticed for short periods. The clincher was the match between the truck's parking position in the video and the narrow road leading from the daycare area directly toward the neighborhood where Mark lived. Although no direct evidence existed, investigators concluded Mark Ellery was the only remaining individual who combined all factors: correct vehicle type and color, residence close to the daycare, documented history of being in the area, and a significant unexplained time gap on the afternoon Evan disappeared. He therefore became the primary person of interest requiring deeper investigation. After identifying Mark Ellery as the most prominent suspect on the list and noting his inability to account for his whereabouts on the afternoon Evan disappeared, investigators moved to the next phase, obtaining a search warrant for the garage at his private residence, the location he claimed to have been working on vehicle parts during the exact time frame of the incident. Once the warrant was approved, the team approached the garage, a small detached wooden structure with a metal roof roll-up door in front and enough interior space for a pickup truck plus maintenance equipment. Immediately upon entry, detectives noticed an anomaly. The concrete floor in the rear section was a different color and brightness than the rest, as if it had been poured relatively recently. Mark explained he had repaired cracking but could not provide a specific date. The vague response heightened suspicion. Suspecting the new concrete might conceal something underneath, the forensics team deployed a drone equipped with a thermal camera to detect temperature differences that could indicate variations in slab thickness, moisture, or thermal conductivity. The drone was operated from outside and flown into the partially open garage to scan the floor in a grid pattern. Within minutes, the monitor displayed an abnormal heat signature, a roughly 1 square meter rectangular area in the left rear corner showed significantly cooler temperatures than the surrounding floor, indicating thicker concrete that still retained internal moisture, consistent with a section poured much later than the original slab. After documenting the thermal images, the team proceeded with direct examination. They isolated the area, collected surface samples, then used a specialty hammer to test acoustic response. The suspicious section produced a deeper hollow sound, suggesting a void or non-solid object beneath. With sufficient probable cause from the thermal scan and acoustic testing, investigators began breaking up the new concrete. The process took several hours because the concrete was still very hard, but once the top layer was removed, they discovered a small manually dug cavity, not deep, but large enough to hide small items. Inside was an old thick plastic bag, wrapped multiple times with duct tape. When opened, it contained several children's items, a pair of green socks with a sun pattern, a plastic toddler spoon, and a thin cloth resembling a baby wipe or burp cloth. The items were discolored by age and smelled strongly of dampness, but retained their shape. Upon seeing the green socks, one detective immediately pulled the 2012 records and confirmed that Evans' drop-off inventory for that day listed one pair of green socks with sun pattern. This made the discovery instantly critical, though laboratory confirmation was still required. All items were cataloged, sealed, and transported directly to the lab. After removing the objects, investigators continued examining the cavity to determine if anything else was present and what tool had been used to dig it, thereby assessing Mark's involvement. The bottom of the cavity showed scrape marks consistent with a hand trowel or small shovel, the type of tool Mark owned in abundance, as observed throughout the garage. Once the concrete removal was complete, focus shifted to evidence analysis. The laboratory was instructed to perform trace DNA testing on every surface of the recovered items. This technique can extract remaining skin cells from handling even after prolonged suboptimal storage. Forensic specialists processed each item under strict anti-contamination protocols. The socks were scanned for cells on the cuff and toe areas. The cloth sections were tested for adhered human cells, and the plastic spoon was examined on the handle where either a child or adult would have held it. DNA samples recovered from the socks and cloth were weak but sufficient for profiling. The spoon contained mixed traces requiring molecular separation to isolate profiles. When analysis was complete, the automated comparison was run against the 2012 case DNA database, which contained Evans' reference samples taken from personal belongings and the family home at the time of disappearance. Results confirmed that the trace DNA on the socks and cloth matched Evan Porter's 2012 profile, proving the two items found in the concrete cavity had once belonged to him. This established the first physical link between Evan's disappearance and Mark Ellery's garage for an individual with an unaccounted-for time window, a vehicle matching the one in the video, and multiple prior visits to the daycare area. The discovery of freshly poured concrete combined with items bearing Evans' DNA marked the biggest breakthrough in the case after more than 10 years of deadlock. After evidence containing Evans' DNA was discovered in a cement cavity beneath the garage floor of Mark Ellery, the investigation moved to the next phase, verifying whether any other locations previously connected to the suspect had been overlooked during the 2012 search. One of the first areas re-examined was the Coal Pond Trail Forest, located north of the daycare, an area that had been eliminated from the original search perimeter based on incorrect information from a maintenance worker who claimed it had been checked within the first hours after Evan vanished. Because the recovered video showed the shadowy figure moving northwest, directly corresponding to the trail leading into Coal Pond Trail, investigators decided to conduct a new, comprehensive search of the entire area using advanced technical methods rather than the manual searches performed in 2012. To do this, they deployed GPR, ground-penetrating radar, a device capable of detecting differences in subsurface structure, soil disturbance, and objects buried beneath the surface. The technical team brought the equipment to the edge of the trail, set up a scanning grid in a zigzag pattern to ensure every section was scanned at least twice, and began sweeping from the points closest to the trail, gradually expanding deeper into the woods. Coal Pond Trail is a mixed-terrain area of damp soil, small rocks, and thick leaf litter, which made GPS signal interpretation more difficult but not impossible. Just over an hour after deployment began, the GPS screen registered an anomaly, an area where the subsurface layers were compressed, shifted, and irregularly stratified, different from the natural soil structure in surrounding areas. The anomaly was an oval-shaped patch nearly 1 meter wide, located behind a small cluster of maple trees, approximately 20 meters off the trail. This was a classic signature of soil that had been dug up and refilled. After marking the exact coordinates and running a second confirmation scan, the anomaly remained unchanged, indicating disturbance at a depth of approximately 40 to 60 cm, entirely consistent with the depth commonly seen in burials involving small children. Investigators immediately isolated the area, set up barriers and markers, and prepared to excavate. The excavation followed forensic protocol. Each layer of soil was carefully removed, photographed, and documented, while all soil was sifted through screens to detect any small objects. When the top layer was pushed aside, the soil color changed noticeably. The bottom layer was lighter and looser than the surrounding earth, confirming the area had been disturbed and refilled not long afterward. At about 30 centimeters deeper, the team uncovered the first clue, a thin piece of pale gray fabric wedged between soil layers. Though deteriorated, the fabric was clearly recognizable as a fragment of children's clothing. Investigators immediately widened the excavation, and by the fourth soil layer, the compact outline of a small body began to emerge. Despite severe decomposition due to time and environmental conditions, the skeletal structure and overall size were entirely consistent with a child approximately 16 months old. The team immediately stopped rough digging and switched to fine tools to avoid disturbing the remains. The body was lifted using a soft recovery method with anti-disintegration cloth to preserve what structure remained. Every detail was documented according to forensic procedure. After the remains were removed from the pit and sealed in a specialized body bag, an on-site examination revealed additional small items near the body, including another smaller piece of fabric, possibly from an inner layer of clothing. When the remains were transported to the New Hampshire office of the chief medical examiner, forensic pathologists examined the skeletal structure, signs of trauma, and the possible presence of external forces. Surprisingly, there were no signs of violent trauma on the skeleton. No fractures, cracks, or serious injuries were recorded. This shifted the pathologist's focus to physiological and environmental factors. Analysis of remaining soft tissue revealed clear evidence of hypothermia. The tissue had decomposed in a pattern consistent with death outdoors in cold conditions, with no mechanical trauma evident on bone or remaining tissue. The preliminary forensic conclusion stated clearly the cause of death was acute hypothermia, occurring when the victim was exposed outdoors for an extended period without protective clothing or a heat source. This conclusion aligned perfectly with the fact that Evan disappeared in February, when temperatures in Lebanon regularly dropped below freezing. The report further noted that no signs of struggle or external mechanical injury were found, indicating the victim had not suffered direct violence prior to death. Simultaneously, investigators cross-referenced field data. The location where the body was found lay exactly along the northwest trajectory the figure in the video had taken after curving slightly toward Coal Pond Trail. The shallow, hastily filled burial suggested this was not a pre-planned act, but rather a panicked attempt to conceal the body quickly. After Evan Porter's remains were recovered from Coal Pond Trail, and additional evidence bearing the boy's DNA was found in the cement cavity beneath Mark Ellery's garage floor. The investigation shifted to reconstructing the entire crime timeline by synthesizing all forensic physical and digital evidence gathered during the case reopening. The first step was piecing together the most critical fragments, the restored microSD card video, showing a figure carrying a small object through the daycare's back door. The silver pickup truck parked right next to the west fence. Traces of freshly poured cement in Mark's garage and children's items found beneath it. And the location where Evan's body was discovered in the woods, directly along the path the figure in the video had taken. Investigators created a detailed timeline of every minute of the afternoon Evan disappeared, starting from the brief moment the playroom staff members stepped away. Although the microSD video was low quality, it was retimed using natural lighting in the frame, and historical weather data, shadow angles and light levels placed the recording in late afternoon, perfectly matching the moment staff returned and discovered Evan missing. By overlaying the figure's silhouette onto the building blueprint, investigators pinpointed the exact camera position, recording direction, and the time the figure moved from the back door out of frame. From this, they calculated the minimum time needed for the figure to carry Evan out the back door and reach the truck parked beside the fence. Less than 15 seconds, consistent with the short window during which no one noticed anything unusual inside the daycare. Next, the team analyzed data related to the silver pickup truck. Based on the video and 2012 witness statements, they confirmed the parking spot matched a narrow strip beside the fence, not fully visible from all angles, but small enough to go unnoticed if parents or staff were focused on the main entrance. Remeasuring the camera angle revealed that because the camera was slightly offset to the right, it only captured the truck's tail and missed any movement from the back door to the driver's side. From this, the team reconstructed the most likely scenario: the figure, whose height, gait, and movements matched Mark Ellery's characteristics, carried Evan from the playroom, down the hallway, out the back door, and to the waiting truck. The next phase of the forensic timeline established the route from the daycare to Mark's garage. Because no cell tower dump had been collected in 2012, investigators sought archived data from the carrier's legacy backup systems. The technical team contacted the carrier's heritage storage department and requested any surviving copies of tower ping records from the Lebanon area around the time of the incident. After weeks of searching physical archives, they located a partial backup on magnetic tape, the kind used for quarterly system snapshots. Although incomplete, it still contained a list of some devices that had connected to the tower near the daycare in the late afternoon of Evan's disappearance. When filtered, investigators found a mobile device registered to Mark Ellery had pinged the tower near the daycare at a time that matched the video of the figure. This did not prove the crime directly, but strongly supported the likelihood that Mark was in the immediate vicinity when Evan vanished. Further analysis of the backup data showed Mark's device pinged a different tower near his home shortly afterward, consistent with the drive from the daycare to his garage. The distance and time gap between pings perfectly matched a 4-6-minute drive home. This solidified the timeline. Evan was carried out the back of the daycare, placed in the truck, driven to Mark's garage, and some of Evan's personal items were hidden beneath freshly poured cement. After completing the daycare to garage segment, the team reconstructed the next leg to Coal Pond Trail, where Evan's body was ultimately found. The drive from Mark's garage to the burial site was only a few minutes via local shortcuts well known to longtime residents. Investigators determined the entire trip could be completed quickly and discreetly, especially on a winter afternoon with few people around. Comparing the burial location to 2012 terrain models revealed the spot was right beside a small, obscure turnoff that only locals who had lived in the area for years would know, consistent with Mark's long-time maintenance work that made him intimately familiar with the surroundings. Soil analysis at the excavation site also showed the hole had been dug with hand tools, the same kind Mark kept in his garage. At the same time, investigators incorporated historical weather data to model the likelihood of death by hypothermia. National Weather Service records confirmed the afternoon Evan disappeared was bitterly cold with strong winds, fully supporting the medical examiner's conclusion. When all pieces were assembled, video figure characteristics, truck location, garage evidence, tower pings, and burial site, the final forensic timeline was seamless. the most cohesive reconstruction since the case was reopened. The timeline clarified the sequence. An adult carried Evan out the daycare's back door, placed him in a silver pickup truck, drove away from the daycare and back to the garage where some of Evan's belongings were hidden under cement, then took Evan into Coal Pond Trail where the boy's body was hastily buried, all within a window that perfectly matched the unexplained gap in Mark Ellery's own timeline. Once the forensic timeline was fully reconstructed, and every piece of evidence, from the restored video, legacy cell tower data, garage evidence, burial site markers at Coal Pond Trail, and the medical examiner's findings, converged into a single unbroken chain of events, the New Hampshire investigation team took the final step, obtaining an arrest warrant for Mark Ellery. The warrant was issued on the grounds that Mark was present near the daycare at the exact time Evan disappeared, appeared in the video with matching physical characteristics, owned a truck that matched the one recorded, had an unexplained gap in his timeline, had Evan's belongings hidden beneath his garage floor, and followed a travel route consistent with the burial location. When arrested at his home, Mark appeared shocked but offered no resistance. He simply repeated that he didn't know anything about it, yet his denials crumbled under the overwhelming volume of forensic evidence. Prosecution moved swiftly, and the initial trial drew intense attention as it was the first time an entire cold case chain of evidence had been rebuilt with such comprehensive modern technology. In court, prosecutors presented the forensic timeline in exact chronological order, the silhouette carrying a small object out the daycare's back door, the appearance of the silver pickup, legacy cell tower data, placing Mark's phone near the daycare at the critical moment, the drive back to the garage, the freshly poured cement concealing Evan's belongings, and finally, the recovery of Evan's body at Coal Pond Trail, with burial signs consistent with the route Mark could have taken. Taken together, prosecutors emphasized that this was not merely circumstantial evidence, but a chain with clear physical connections. Evan's DNA in the garage, a burial location tied to the suspect's path, and a figure whose height, gait, and movements matched Mark's. Defense counsel attempted to argue that the video was too blurry to identify anyone, that silver F-150 sets were common, and that trace DNA could result from cross-contamination, but these arguments were quickly dismantled when forensic experts demonstrated the inseparable links between each piece of evidence. In particular, the freshly poured cement containing Evan's belongings, found in a location to which only Mark had exclusive access, became the pivotal point the jury could not ignore. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, Mark Ellery guilty on multiple counts, including kidnapping of a minor, concealing evidence, improper disposal of a body, and causing death by removing a young child from a safe environment, resulting in death by hypothermia. He received a lengthy sentence, reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the prolonged suffering inflicted on the victim's family. Once the conviction became final, the Evan Porter case was officially closed, accompanied by a comprehensive report detailing every investigative failure from 2012, from prematurely eliminating Coal Pond Trail based on one worker's word, to failing to follow up on reports of a silver pickup, delaying cell tower dumps, and not thoroughly checking the daycare camera system. The report was added to training materials to ensure similar mistakes would not be repeated in future missing child cases, finally bringing to an end a journey that lasted more than a decade, in which technology, persistence, and a forensic timeline delivered the final answer to Evan Porter's fate. The story of Evan Porter's disappearance in Lebanon, New Hampshire, solved after more than 10 years thanks to modern forensic technology, offers many sobering lessons for life in America today, especially as families balance work, children, and growing reliance on daycare systems, surveillance technology, and community safety protocols. One of the most striking details is that the daycare never properly checked its camera system, causing the micro SD card to remain lost behind a wall for years. This reflects a broader reality in the U.S. Many private child care facilities lack clear equipment maintenance protocols, and parents often assume every system works perfectly. An important takeaway is that parents should proactively ask about safety procedures. Never hesitate to question how cameras are maintained, whether doors are controlled, and how staff are trained. The case also shows how early mistakes, such as eliminating Coal Pond Trail based solely on one employee's statement, can send an entire investigation down the wrong path. In everyday life, this reminds us never to rush to judgment and always to verify information, no matter how trustworthy the source seems. Additionally, the fact that Mark Ellery was identified through a forensic timeline and legacy cell tower data serves as a powerful reminder that technology can rescue a case, but initial thoroughness remains critical. Finally, the story underscores the value of persistence in seeking truth. In today's fast-moving American society where stories are quickly forgotten, Evan Porter's case reminds us that no answer comes too late, and justice arrives only when we keep demanding it. Thank you for following the entire journey to unravel the Evan Porter case. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more in-depth investigation stories like this one. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring cases that seemed long forgotten, but whose truth is still waiting to be uncovered.